using my name at Sine Anahita, and I'm from the University of Alaska Fairbanks. I really thank Alex for inviting me down to talk about this issue. I have been in Alaska for 7 years, and I'm a gender scholar. And one of the things that happens when you're a sociologist, whatever paradigm that you look at your data, that's all you see. So when I got up to Alaska and was reading about us, getting in airplanes and hunting wolves from the air, or some of the other kind of practices of wolf control, then of course what I saw was gender. And I proposed this idea kind of as an afterthought at a presentation that I did at a rural sociology society meeting, and I had a man come up to me afterwards who was very angry at me and very defensive and said, it has nothing to do with gender. And so as soon as he said that, I realized that I was onto something. So I wrote this paper with Tammy Mix, who was also at the University of Alaska at Fairbanks at the same time. So I'm just gonna read the paper. I'm going to start out with saying masculinity shapes relationships among people. They also shape people's relationships with non-human animals. In the long history of humanity's control of wolves, masculinity has determined the manner in which wolves are targeted, whether and how they are killed, and to what extent governments are involved. Alaska's recent reinstitution of aerial wolf control, in which wolves are shot from low-flying airplanes or from aircraft that land after tracking wolves from the air, dramatically illustrates these gender issues. In this article, we analyze news articles about Alaska wolf control that are published during 14 years, and all these articles were from the Anchorage Daily News. We apply Connell, who is one of the most prominent masculinity theorists, his ideas about frontier masculinity to create an understanding of Alaska wolf politics. Frontier masculinity centers on cultural myths about real and imagined heroic frontiersmen and cowboys. We contend that in Alaska, frontier masculinity is constructed and sustained at the state level, and it's sustained at the state level by influential policymakers and is promulgated by the major news outlets. As we documented, there's been significant pressure against Alaska wolf control policies, including major challenges to the frontier masculinity that shapes and support the policies. But rather than letting go of frontier masculinity, we claim that Alaska policymakers have retrofitted it, and they've retrofitted it to garner public support for dominion over Alaska's wolves. We call this retooled form retro frontier masculinity. And we claim that retro-frontier masculinity has been developed as a response to systemic change. So the first section of the paper is entitled Frontier Masculinity in Alaska. In the U.S. national imagination, Alaska is mythologized, and it's mythologized as exceptional and unique in multiple ways. Many state policies support this mythological aspects of the state, especially this idea that Alaska is the last frontier. Smelzer, who is another theorist, describes how myths serve particular functions, including bonding different groups together in a collective denial of reality and providing narratives that can be deployed for political ends. Alaska politicians exploit the myth of the state's exceptionalism as a last frontier for political advantage. Kimmel, who is another very prominent gender theorist, documents that U.S. history has been shaped by these chronic anxieties and insecurities about national masculinity, and that the obsessive compulsion to constantly prove American masculinity spurred the quest to tame the Western frontier. We claim that a particular form of masculinity plays a central role in the myth of Alaska as a modern-day frontier, and that it's maintained and legitimized not only by the attitudes and actions of individual men and women, but more important for the purpose of this article, that it's maintained by state agencies and by politicians working to maintain cultural hegemony through the regional media. Now, Connell's the one who first came up with the idea of frontier masculinity, and he actually did it in a passing way to talk about the wolves, this form of masculinity that's built on myths of the frontier. So, for instance, he would claim like Daniel Boone and cowboys and Paul Bunyan are all examples of this frontier masculinity. We find Connell's description of frontier masculinity to be especially important to use when we're exploring the gendered aspects of the wolf control issue in Alaska, so we expanded on his notion. So like Connell's concept, Alaska's frontier masculinity is mythological and it's fantasy-based. It's an idealized form of public masculinity. It's a state-level masculinity. It's not a form of masculinity to which individual men are held accountable, but it's state level. It's something more abstract that's built throughout the social system. Frontier masculinity as an ideal is built on this romanticized understandings of wilderness, of rugged self-sufficiency, courage, masculine body strength, and autonomous individualism. Another part that's really important about understanding frontier masculinity is that it includes this active subordination of nature as integral from it. From at least the mid-19th century, U.S. men imagined frontiers as places to which they could escape the stifling civilization and feminine domestication, and to where they could return to an authentic masculinity tested and honed by strenuous and virtuous labor. Like the imagined Paul Bunyan, who manhandled huge timbers into submissive logs, or the fantasy cowboy who wrestled powerful steers to the ground for branding, men who define death to overcome dangerous aspects of wilderness and rurality have long been hailed as these masculine heroes. For Kimmel, the cowboy is a mythical icon of compulsive masculinity. His words, not mine. Fierce, courageous, unemotional, unattached, and with a singular purpose of conquering nature, the cowboy embodies all the mythical ideals of frontier masculinity. Throughout its history, first as a territory and then as a state, Alaska has been defined and primarily understood as male space, especially as a playground for white adventurers, treasure seekers, and sport hunters. Frontier masculinity played a central role in the 1890s to 1920s gold rush Alaska, and before that in the quest for riches through the fur trade. And if you think about it, this grizzled fur trapper and the rugged gold prospector are culturally celebrated heroes of frontier masculinity. And they're credited with battling a hostile and hazardous climate, vast wilderness, and dangerous animals to subordinate natural forces. The thousands of immigrants who flowed to Alaska in the wake of oil exploration in the 1970s and 80s carried with them their own visions of this mythical Alaska. And today, the heavily masculinized oil industry is seen as the ultimate site for machismo and the romanticized cowboy hero. And the myth of frontier masculinity persists in the oil industry. But frontier masculinity has been constructed within the context of wilderness, an especially important element of the myth of Alaska as a frontier. Rural and wilderness areas are seen as sites where men can be real masculine men, where men in cities that are overly civilized, they're affected and they're effeminate. Wilderness areas are imagined as places where men can go wild and where they can experience masculine freedoms unavailable in stifling, feminized, and domesticated cities. Wilderness occupations are considered to be particularly manly, as men overpowering natural forces in their quest to make a living is very highly valued. Work has long functioned as to help form masculine identities with heavy, dirty, and dangerous work. The kinds of work traditionally available in Alaska and other frontiers are associated with especially manly men. Strength and power are central to constructions of masculinity, and they are essential elements of frontier masculinity. So hunting prowess may be the most significant aspect of Alaska's frontier masculinity. Hunting success is seen as necessary on an individual level, but more important for our purposes, masculine hunting success is a state issue, and it's a vital element of Alaska's myth of the frontier. Early 20th century sportsmen, writers, helped to create the myth that there's a moose behind every tree in Alaska, and that hunters barely needed to aim accurately to bag themselves a trophy moose. Hunting for sport, for food, is very highly gendered. Nationally, this is a study that was done about a decade ago. Nationally, less than 7% of women hunt, and men are up to 20 times more likely to hunt, regardless of any other demographic variable. In patriarchal cultures, such as the one that we live in, violence is part of what it means to be a man, including normative participation in blood sports like trophy hunting. Killing animals that are especially fierce, like wolves or bears, has long been considered an indicator of manly virility. Another way that hunting is gendered is revealed by the fact that hunters, when they're interviewed, say that it makes them feel manly to kill. Within hunting cultures, hunting is valorized, and men who don't hunt or men who show sympathy for hunted animals are considered not to be real men. In Alaska, hunting cannot be separated from the myth of frontier masculinity, and in fact, hunting is central to the concept. So, hunting communities justify hunting in multiple ways. They claim it's a God-given right. They say that it provides sustenance for families, that it's a duty to protect crops against pests, that it's instinctual, that it's a cultural imperative, and it's the most important way that men obtain prestige and authority within their communities. It also is claimed to be a way of sustaining traditional rural community, and as a rural sociologist, this is something I'm particularly interested in as well. These key concepts reveal how hunting is intimately connected with issues of masculinity. These discourses about natural rights, family provider, paternalist duty, instinct, traditional culture, a route to authority, and sustaining traditional community life are all tightly woven with issues of masculinity. Indeed, as Emil claims, hunting and killing are definitive of masculinity, and as we claim here, they're definitive of the myth of frontier masculinity. Well, as we all know, in Alaska, sport hunting is strongly supported by state policies. Many influential policymakers identify themselves as sport hunters, and state agencies and decision-making bodies have traditionally been controlled by the sport hunting lobby. But here, as elsewhere, hunting's under siege as an increasingly vocal anti-hunting movement exerts pressures on hunting communities and state government. We argue that because hunting and statewide hunter success are such integral parts of the myth of frontier masculinity, that state agencies will routinely intervene to protect them and to sustain them. Due to the dominance and pervasiveness of the myth of frontier masculinity in Alaska, its values are instituted into state policies on hunting and wildlife issues. And in Alaska, which is kind of unusual, its wildlife policies are set by the entity that we've been talking about all day, the Alaska Board of Game. This agency has historically upheld policies of aggressive control and domination of wildlife, including in targeting the entire wolf population in several areas. Throughout much of Alaska's history, the board has been comprised almost exclusively of men. This is no accident. And like other states, the board is dominated currently by individuals active in the sport hunting industry, sports hunters, fur trappers, professional game guides. Now, eco-feminists note that values of aggressive control and domination of nature, wild places, and wild animals are strongly linked with patriarchal domination. The policies instituted by Alaska's Board of Games have historically demonstrated the accuracy of this claim, as year after year the board works to maintain frontier masculinity through valorizing hunting and through aggressive subordination of wildlife, including Alaska's bears. Now I want to talk a bit about the wolf and the image of the wolf in frontier masculinity. As you know, Alaska's had a long and very complicated history with its wild wolf packs. Wolves have functioned as scapegoats all around the world in different cultures. As McBride claims, whether the scapegoat is really guilty of the accused crime or not doesn't really matter. It's mythically guilty, and so it's considered unquestionably by community members to be in fact guilty. The problems of the community are foisted on the scapegoat, and in this case, wolves, and the scapegoat gets its just desserts, death. In Alaska, wolves have been placed in this time-honored role of scapegoat. As early as the 1920s, the U.S. federal and Alaska territorial governments collaborated in predator control projects that targeted the territory's wolves for extermination, claiming that wolves were competitors with sportsmen for trophy doll sheep. Alaska's policies about wolves mirrored federal eradication policies throughout the U.S. Especially in western states, wolves were portrayed as not only useless to humans, but also as menacing, ferocious vermin that threatened stockmen's livelihoods. They were undeserving of life or even a merciful end to it. In the late 19th and early 20th centuries, it was considered unmanly for men to show emotion, including sympathy for the suffering of wolves as they were being killed. In the 1930s, following publication of Murray's famous book, The Wolves of Mount McKinley, Wolf killing projects in Alaska were canceled, then they were reinstituted, then canceled again, as public and scientific opinion favorable to wolves encountered stiff opposition from big game hunters. During the 1940s and part of the 1950s, wolf eradication programs continued throughout the territory. An untold number of wolves were killed by sportsmen on snow machines and through poisoning and trapping. The U.S. government aided the territory's efforts to eradicate wolves by financing a bounty system and by paying federal agents to shoot wolves from airplanes. Jay Hammond, who then was our future governor of Alaska, boasted of killing 300 wolves from his plane in just 1 month in the 1950s. His actions were hailed as heroic in the territory of Alaska. But in the mid-1950s, new federal policy officially terminated some wolf control programs, and portending the nature of future conflicts, Alaska's residents bristled at what was termed outside interference with local wildlife issues. So when Alaska became a state in 1959, one of the central tenets was that Alaska could set its own wildlife policies free from federal interference. Aerial wolf control programs and on-the-ground trapping and hunting of wolves continued to be unregulated in most of Alaska until the mid-1960s, when the state legislature for the first time classified wolves as big game animals and fur bearers and required a hunting license to kill wolves. The consequence of the reclassification from vermin to game meant that not only federal agents, but the general public could shoot wolves from airplanes. In the 1970s, the burgeoning environmental movement helped pass the Federal Airborne Hunting Act, claiming that killing wildlife from the air was unfair chase. The passage of the act put a stop to most of Alaska's wolf hunting by air. However, on-the-ground hunting of wolves for sport and for fur continued, and wolves continued to be scapegoated for plummeting moose and caribou populations. In the 1980s and 1990s, public conflict about wolves escalated both nationally and also statewide, with sportsmen's groups pressuring Alaska's legislature and Board of Game to increase wolf eradication programs, and with environmentalist groups working to protect the state's wolf packs. Meanwhile, elsewhere in the United States, wolves were protected under the 1966 Endangered Species Act. Outside Alaska in the mid-1990s, several wolf reintroduction projects and protection programs for the few wild wolf populations that still survived were highly successful in reestablishing vibrant wolf populations in several states, although they were always with local conflict. In Alaska, state policies fluctuated in the 1990s, sometimes authorizing wolf eradication programs and at other times restricting them, depending on who controlled the Alaska Board of Game, the state legislature, and the governorship. In 2004, which was the year after I arrived in Alaska, the state resumed its internationally controversial policy of exterminating wolves by air, and it continues to enact state policies that encourage land-based hunters and trappers to kill wolves. The result is that more than 15% of Alaska's wolves are killed legally each year, and influential policymakers are working to expand the state-sponsored aerial wolf extermination program. And for example, in 2005, 89% of the wolves in one particular area were scheduled to be killed. Now, throughout Alaska's historical relationship with its wolves, groups promoting a particular form of public state-level masculinity, frontier masculinity, have controlled state policy through domination of the legislature and the state's wildlife management agencies. The fact that groups maintaining such ideologies have been the ones to control official policymaking institutions has meant that Alaska's wolf policies are designed to support sportsmen and frontiersmen's values of subordination of wildlife. This is in spite of marked resistance from most wildlife scientists, environmentalists, animal rights groups, and a majority of citizens in both the United States and in Alaska. Although many authors have noted the symbolic value of wolves, an area that's under-theorized is the gendered aspect of that symbolism, and into this subject, Tammy, Mix, and I step. Now we're talking about challenges and changes to frontier masculinity. Economies and political systems may collapse, but hegemonic masculinities are always collectively retooled to fit new realities. For Alaska men, frontier masculinity is no longer available like it was during the big sport hunting, fur trading, gold rush, or oil pipeline days. We believe because of multiple factors that have exerted significant pressure on traditional frontier masculinity, Alaska policymakers have retooled it so as to restore its hegemonic power. One of the factors exerting pressure on frontier masculinity has been economic restructuring. Downsizing in extraction industries such as the oil industry, the timber industry, and gold mining, and the decline in the international market for fur has eliminated many traditional Alaska frontiersman occupations. In addition, cultural imperialism has marginalized and even obliterated traditional forms of masculinity on which men have relied on generations. Transnational capitalism has eroded the social acceptability of traditional Alaska frontier masculinity. The new internationally hegemonic form of masculinity now is this transnational business masculinity, and this is a concept that Connell's also come up with. This is a form of masculinity that is not available to Alaska men except in urban areas like Anchorage. Still, another factor that's exerted pressure on frontier masculinity is global climate change, which has caused shifts in migration patterns of birds, marine life, and land mammals. It's degraded wildlife habitat, and it's linked to, some studies have linked it to plummeting moose populations. For frontiersmen and sportsmen in Alaska, these changes are being experienced as declining hunter success. Fish and wildlife populations supported indigenous people in what was to become Alaska for thousands of years until significant white migration in the early part of the 20th century taxed wildlife populations to near extinction. After federal and territorial governments instituted wolf kill projects, caribou and moose populations exploded to unnaturally high numbers, resulting in huge, widespread populations easily exploited by hunters and giving rise to this mythical perception that there is a trophy moose behind every tree in the state. The phenomenal success of sport hunters during extensive wolf eradication programs is part of the basis on which traditional frontier masculinity was built in the 20th century. But after extensive wolf control was cut back, and after a series of population crashes among moose and caribou due to human manipulation of their population, habitat degradation, and overhunting by humans, sportsmen's hunting success is no longer guaranteed as it was in the old days of frontier masculinity. Now, in Alaska discourse, shifts in transnational capitalism, economic restructuring, climate change, and overhunting are not typically blamed for the pressure on men and frontier masculinity. Instead, wolves are the ones that have been blamed. They've been scapegoated. As a Midwestern rancher explained, quote, "While international markets and corporatization can be really quite complex, wolves are very simple. They fit straight in the scope of a rifle." So in Alaska, blame is attributed to the lack of state policies that keep wolves under control and out of areas especially convenient for hunting. In fact, policymakers scape wolves in spite of overwhelming scientific evidence that wolves are not primarily responsible for the decline of caribou and moose populations, for which they've been blamed and targeted by eradication. Now, structural changes such as those described above have very gendered implications. For example, working class men experience unemployment as emasculation. Men experiencing economic downsizing tend to tighten their physical and financial control over wives and children as a way to shore up their power and their sense of manliness. They may also increase their expression of misogyny and homophobia, and they project their anger towards women, ethnic minority communities, and other scapegoats. Among men whose masculine identity is based on dominance over nature, the inability to be successful at hunting, to dominate an animal by killing it, is a profound challenge to their masculinity. Big game hunting is an ancient mode by which men gain authority and prestige in their communities. So when hunting is constrained, men lose a primary route by which they accrue power. Because they experience a situation as their traditional masculinity being under siege, they have to find other ways to be men. And this, we claim, is what is happening to Alaska men who have relied on frontier masculinity as their way to be manly. As men come to feel embattled and feel their masculine identities under siege, They turned to their communities and to male-dominated institutions like the Alaska Game Board and the state legislature to help them craft new ways to be men. This underscores the fact that creating new ways for men to be manly is not an individual pursuit, but that it's structured at the level of the state. Some theorists, including Connell, analyze the state as a gendered institution, claiming that it's best viewed as a state of practices that institutionalize power relationships, and that it's largely, of course, for the benefit of men. Connell further expands the idea that gendered practices are structured and not just the property of individual men when he describes a crisis tendency of dominant masculinities. According to Connell, when a dominant masculinity like frontier masculinity is threatened, there are structural, often national attempts to reestablish and reaffirm the threatened masculinity. In U.S. history, one recurring strategy deployed to reaffirm masculinity is the reification of the cult of the outdoorsman. Originally emerging in the 19th century, it's been revived several times during masculinity's moments of national crisis. In Alaska, the newspaper resources we analyzed demonstrate that attempts to reestablish and reaffirm frontier masculinity occurred at the state level. We claim that Alaska policymakers retooled traditional masculinity so as to restore its dominance, but they did so in ways that reflect new emphases. And as we will discuss, we call this retooled form retro-frontier masculinity, in that it's a revived form of an older masculinity. Now, I'm going to skip my whole method section and save you that sociological boredom. If you have questions about it, though, I'll be glad to answer them later. This next section is called the fading of frontier masculinity. By the 1990s, after a century of hegemony, frontier masculinity was enduring significant challenges. An iconographic moment occurred in 1990 when a group of prominent sportsmen was arrested and charged with illegally using airplanes to harass a pack of wolves before killing them. In the news article about the crime, the U.S. Fish and Wildlife investigator implied the men simply got carried away with the thrill of the hunt. In spite of the investigator's boys will be boys attitude, the men were charged with a series of crimes. The writer of the article was the outdoors editor for the Anchorage Daily News. Although ostensibly the article was about the crime, most of the article lauded the mythological hunting reputation of Jack Frost, the ringleader who was arrested in the case. The writer noted that Frost had killed every species of large animal in the United States by bow, and that he had received multiple awards from hunting organizations. Well, this is an article that was supposed to be about the crime, but he's really lauding Jack Frost. The writer gave Frost esteemed status as an admired, untamed, rebellious sportsman, as a, quote, outlaw aerial wolf hunter, end quote. Throughout the article, frontier masculinity was valorized. However, evidence that this was a moment when frontier masculinity shifted from its previous hegemonic position is that Frost received a number of anonymous threatening phone calls. We believe this signals a shift in the way the anonymous public felt about harassing and killing wolves from the air and in the violent performance of frontier masculinity. Less than a year later, the influence of frontier masculinity on state wildlife policy after nearly 100 years of control was waning. In 1991, the Alaska Board of Game instituted a series of new policies based on the recommendations of a 16-member alliance that was composed of both sports hunters and pro-wolf environmentalists. The new policies included limits on wolf hunting, including restricting same-day airborne hunting tactics, which had allowed previously hunters to track wolves from the air, land, and then shoot them. Sports hunters decried the limits, with one claiming that killing wolves is an essential freedom, and another saying, I have as much a right and privilege to shoot a wolf as someone else has to watch a wolf. Doug Pope, who was then the chair of the Game Board, acknowledged the past role played by frontier masculinity, saying, airborne hunting is the, this is a quote, airborne hunting is the last sort of the remnant of the cowboy mentality that used to pervade here in Alaska, the sort of outlaw mentality, end quote. Pope decided the new policy would restrict airborne hunting to special cases, saying, we're on the edge of a new era. In successive years, frontier masculinity, as embodied in the state's wolf control policies, was increasingly challenged. 1 year after Pope's statement about new board policies and the new era, Governor Hickel appointed a staunch proponent of wolf control to replace him. The board once again talked about instituting widespread aerial wolf control, yielding to complaints by sportsmen that wolves competed with them for wild game. State biologists with the Division of Wildlife Conservation radio-collared 25 wolves with the intent of tracking them to their packs and then killing entire packs with shotguns from helicopters. 500 wolves were to be targeted. The plan was presented to the public as rational and as scientific, emphasizing the fact that it would be state biologists using the shotguns and the helicopters. But national outrage over Alaska's plan filled Governor Hickel's mailbox and jammed phone lines to the Division of Wildlife Conservation. A threatened national tourism boycott called by animal rights and environmental groups put the game board and state biologists on the defensive. National criticism of the plan included proposed congressional legislation forbidding Alaska's plans and threats to investigate the state's use of radio collars under the Federal Communications Commission regulations. In newspaper reports, frontier masculinity seemed to be vying with this form of masculinity that bristled with adolescent schoolyard bullying language from national officials. And as an example of that, Representative DeFazio, who was a Democrat from Oregon at the time, claimed that the state would suffer a black eye if it went ahead with its plan. With national attention focused on Alaska's Board of Game and Sport hunters, the threats to Alaska's frontier masculinity were obvious. As a result of the international pressure, Governor Hicks on Anchorage Daily News headline proclaimed, "Backed down," canceled the proposed aerial wolf control plan and called for the infamous Wolf Summit, which was an event that really did become notorious. The governor, the report stated, used bad judgment in approving the plan, and now he had a political disaster on his hands. The article warned that sportsmen and the hardliners in the Department of Fish and Game who continued to press for aerial wolf control were promoting an issue that the rest of the United States would never allow, even though Alaska proponents parade, posture, and pout. The article framed proponents of wolf control as stubborn, spoiled little boys. Relying on the elements of frontier masculinity that had long shaped the wolf control issue, especially the taken for granted lethal subordination of wolves, no longer worked to justify why the state should carry on with its proposed wolf eradication plans. Governor Hickel, in response to a question from an NBC News journalist about why Alaska should institute wolf control, answered rather infamously, "Well, you can't just let nature run wild. Nature must be dominated according to game board policies, shaped by masculinity that's a frontier masculinity." A week later, Hickel, in a widely published letter in 1992, said, "Folks outside of Alaska misunderstood the wolf issue." In a very telling tactical shift, instead of claiming sportsmen's right to kill wolves, Hickel claimed that wolves were preventing Alaska family men from meeting the nutritional needs of their families. Deploying strategic bewilderment, the governor said Alaska's family providers were confused about why animal rights advocates did not want their families to have food to eat. This change from the state's formerly steadfast maintenance of sportsmen's right to dominate nature, to not allow it to run wild, to an emphasis on men as embattled family providers, unable to put food on their tables, signals a shift of public policy to one shaped by what we call retro-frontier masculinity. Now, here it is about retro-frontier masculinity. For many decades, the ideal of frontier masculinity, including the legacy of the mythological cowboy, framed the issue of wolf control. Emerging from the legacy of frontier masculinity are ideas about sportsmen's rights to unquestioned total dominion over animals and nature. However, under the pressures of outrage over Alaska's aerial wolf control policies, the state's policymakers sought to reframe the issue, and they did so, we claim, by retooling and retrofitting frontier masculinity. In the process of retrofitting frontier masculinity, policymakers continued to frame the wolf control as the rights of sportsmen to subordinate nature, but they extended their frames to include alternative, perhaps even more compelling reasons for lethal wolf control. Frames is a social movement idea. Their frames are sets of interpretations of events made by a social movement to attract activists, to mobilize supporters, and to challenge the opposition. The new frames, or strategic emphases, included vilification of opponents as feminized, casting wolf hunters as paternalist protectors, reification of the masculine family provider role, and analysis of the issue as fundamentally about good old-fashioned competition. These emphases often overlap. A key part of the retrofit process is deploying values that have historical, even ancient precedent that is just reframed for a new project. First of all, vilifying opponents as feminized is one of the reframed strategies undertaken as the state's policymakers sought to retrofit frontier masculinity. As Connell and Kimmel, both very esteemed gender theorists, document, masculinity is constructed in opposition to anything feminine, and being associated with sissyhood is the ultimate insult. Previously, Alaska's policymakers had little need to vilify their opponents as feminized because the values of traditional frontier masculinity were hegemonic. Early in 1993, policymakers realized that compromise on the wolf control issue might be necessary, but they had to reassure the public that compromise did not threaten the state's traditional form of masculinity. The tendency to compromise had not been a part of frontier masculinity, in large part because any sign of sensitivity, compassion, or desire for non-hierarchical processes connoted wimpiness. For example, Michael Carey, editor of the Anchorage Daily News, sought to reassure readers that being against aerial wolf control did not necessarily make one less of a real Alaska man. And here's a quote. The legendary game warden, Sam White of Fairbanks, hardly a posy sniffer, had no use for aerial wolf hunting because it gives hunters an unfair, non-sportsmanlike advantage over their prey. Embodying sportsmanlike values such as giving prey a fair chance, he claimed, doesn't mean that the hunter is an effete, flower-loving environmentalist. Another example of the tactic of vilification of opponents as feminized appeared in 1992 when an opinion writer wrote an article criticizing central players in the wolf control controversy. He trivialized those opposed to state employees gunning down wolves from the air as defenders of forest creatures and characterized activists as, quote, little old ladies with umbrellas. The writer feminized those opposed to aerial wolf control as a way to delegitimize their stance. In 1994, an event occurred that underscored the effectiveness of accusations of sissyhood. Gordon Haber, an influential wolf biologist and activist, and an accompanying TV reporter videotaped several wolves caught in snares that had been set by the state. The snares had been touted as humane because they supposedly instantly killed animals by strangulation. Haber's video, however, pictured wolves who were not only still alive, but who were suffering dreadfully. The footage was graphic, it was grisly, it was horrifying, and it was widely published on TV newscasts. In national newspapers and also on the internet, an Alaska Fish and Game employee was pictured on the videotape shooting a wolf point blank 5 times before it succumbed. Immediately after the footage of the dying wolves was published, the newly elected Democratic governor, Tony Knowles, and the Fish and Game Commissioner, Carl Rozier, terminated the state's wolf control project. However, the next day, the Board of Game sought proposals on how to implement a new law passed by Republican state representatives requiring the state to manage wildlife populations for the sole benefit of human consumption. The law stated that if problems with game arose, the Department of Fish and Game was required to kill predators and to burn timber before it could limit human hunting activities. Public criticism of killing wolves using helicopters and machine guns was discounted as mere, quote, sissified squeamishness. It's long been unmanly to show sympathy for wolves as they're being killed. However, the tactic of publicly vilifying opponents as sissies emerged only when the values of frontier masculinity needed to be retooled. Sportsmen's groups put pressure on the legislature during the 8 years Knowles was governor, and pro-hunting legislators decimated budgets of agencies that did not comply with demands for aggressive wolf control projects. In 1996 and again in 2000, citizens' initiatives passed that forbade the state from instituting aerial wolf hunting, although the initiatives were circumvented on the inauguration of Knowles' Republican successor. But during his tenure, Knowles refused to allow lethal wolf control, calling for an external scientific study, and allowed only non-lethal means of control such as relocation and sterilization programs. In addition, he sought to appoint members of the Alaska Board of Game who were moderate on wildlife issues and who represented ideological diversity. As a result, many letters to the editor contained derogatory remarks, not only hinting at his lack of manliness, but also questioning the masculinity of his appointees to the game board. Even after the new pro-wolf control Governor Murkowski took office, letters continued to accuse Knowles of having run a sissified game board. In 2003, a letter writer expressed relief that Murkowski had appointed a game board with strong pro-wolf control values. Here's a quote. 8 years of gutless leadership concerning wolf control have finally come to an end. The powder puff picks that Governor Tony Knowles had on the game board were there to serve the tourist industry, not to feed the people of Alaska, end quote. A couple of weeks later, a letter writer asked, why did they never attack Governor Tony Knowles for instituting no effective predator control and turning our game board into a bunch of wolf huggers? Another tactic that gained utility during the retrofitting of frontier masculinity was casting wolves as threatening and as wolf hunters as protectors. Recalling that the hero of Little Red Riding Hood was a hunter who killed the wolf, wolves were cast as a threat to children. Here's another letter, I'll quote from a letter. Participants talked of the danger the wolves pose for children walking to school in the dark, claimed one article. Wolves are often spotted from classrooms and parents fear for the children's safety, a woman claimed. This tactic, which of course plays on very ancient myths, raised the specter of innocent children being killed by bold, out-of-control wolves. The state's project to kill wolves was thus framed as a way to protect children. There's another study that talks about how men in Norway who felt that their rural lifestyle was under siege utilized similar rhetorical strategies, claiming that the weakest members of their communities, in this case elderly people, women, and children, were the most likely to be killed by wolves and thus were in need of paternalist protection. Related to the tactic of framing the wolf control as being necessary to protect women, children, and elderly people, with the emergence of retro-frontier masculinity, the state's wolf policies began to emphasize the need for family men to have enough moose to hunt to provide meat for their families. Previously, this had mostly been a side issue, with sport hunters' rights to kill trophy bull moose or their right to kill wolves for sport were taking discursive precedence. Part of the reframing of the wolf control issue, then, is a reification of the masculine family provider role. In 2002, Republican Frank Murkowski was elected governor after running a campaign that promoted lethal wolf control to increase moose populations available to family providers. The National Rifle Association awarded Murkowski a grade of A, while his opponent, Fran Ulmer, a woman who had been Knowles' assistant lieutenant governor, received an F. On inauguration, the new governor made it clear to opponents of wolf control that retro-frontier masculinity would shape the state's wildlife policies. Murkowski was now, quote, considering how radical a board of game he wants to nominate and how fast to start wolf control, someone complained in the Anchorage Daily News. The cry to enslave Mother Nature and kill wolves with a false expectation of improving moose populations is growing throughout Alaska. Will the new administration use scientific data, which actually, as we have heard earlier, showed that bears account for most moose predation, or will he just approve the misguided, wanton killing of wolves? Within a month, the answer was had. Murkowski replaced 6 out of 7 members of the Board of Game, stacking it with professional game guides and sport hunters. The lone woman appointee was a professional game guide. The first sentence of the article describing the move portrayed Murkowski as a decisive and masculine warrior. Murkowski, quote, waded into the predator-controlled battlefield when he put his firm stamp on the Alaska Board of Game. At the first Board of Game meeting after the 2002 gubernatorial election, 45 people complained about wolves. Many were hunters from an area where a study had documented not a general lack of moose, but only a shortage of bull moose within 1 mile of town, indicating predation by humans, not wolves. However, families were said to be suffering for lack of meat, and a resident claimed, We have so many wolves in our country that people are carrying handguns to the outhouse. The board acted swiftly to demonstrate its newly restored muscle. Aerial wolf control plans were instituted, and the state attorney was directed to find a way to circumvent the anti-aerial wolf hunting amendment to the state's constitution that had earlier been passed by citizens. Meanwhile, polls showed 76% of Alaskans were opposed to state-sponsored lethal wolf control. This is in 2003. The legislature also whirled into action, passing bills allowing wolf control practices that had earlier been prohibited by voters. Ralph Seekins, a first-term senator from Fairbanks, which is where I'm from, introduced a bill allowing the Board of Game to make a preemptive strike against predators. Passed by the legislature and signed by the new governor, the bill allowed preemptive strikes against predators even if moose or caribou populations were not threatened. Seekins claimed he wanted wolves killed efficiently, effectively, and professionally by using state sharpshooters flying low in helicopters. Another reframed strategic emphasis state policymakers utilized was to consider the wolf control issue in terms of fairness and competition. There are three elements to this. Structuring aerial wolf hunts is a matter of fair competition between wolves and their pursuers, questioning whether wolves deserve fair competition, and framing wolf control as necessary to limit wolves' competition with family providers seeking to put meat on their family tables. An example of how the issue is framed in terms of making aerial wolf control a matter of fair competition between wolves and humans occurred in 2003. Murkowski, the new governor, authorized aerial wolf control under strict limitations. Volunteer pilots using their own resources, including their own planes, their own fuel, their own guns and ammunition. Framing the wolf control issue as one fundamentally about fair competition, Murkowski said, quote, "Humaneness is in the eye of the beholder. If you run them down on a helicopter and shoot them, that's pretty efficient. If you run them down on a super cub, that requires a little bit more skill, and the wolf has probably got a better chance," end quote. Alternately, some policymakers questioned whether wolves even deserve to be treated with any fairness and competition. Said a member of an advisory committee to the Alaska Board of Game, quote, "I don't believe in fair chase for vermin. If you're trying to get rid of them, why worry about it?" End quote. A third way that the idea of competition is utilized in retro frontier masculinity is describing wolf control projects as giving human hunters a competitive advantage against wolves in their mutual quest for food. When in 2003 the Board of Game announced plans to kill all wolves in a 1,700 square mile area and to begin an equally aggressive wolf kill plan in another area, competition was the key part of the discussion. Paul Jocelyn of the Alaska Wildlife Alliance termed the hunt plans a posse in the sky. Priscilla Farrell, head of Friends of Animals, told Republican Representative Ralph Seekins, "That's barbaric and out of touch with Alaska and the rest of the world. In 2003, it really is an ethical outrage to be blasting wolves with shotguns." Seekins' response was, quote, "We have to eliminate the competition to feed Alaskans." More fundamentally, Seekins also revealed what is now obvious to everyone who's studied the wolf control issue. Quote, "This really isn't about wolves. This is about who gets to control Alaska. They want us to compromise and compromise and compromise until there's nothing left." So I'm going to finish off with some reflections. In Alaska, wolves are reprising a role they've played for centuries. They're scapegoats at the state level, where they pay for the multiple pressures against masculinity with their very lives. A legitimate question might be, why wolves? There's several biologists and other theorists who document that in the Yellowstone Park area, mountain lions are actually the main culprits in livestock predation, and that they're responsible for many attacks on humans. Yet there's little mention of mountain lions as a problem in the local press. At the same time, mere discussion of a wolf reintroduction program elicited much negative publicity, including these dire predictions of children being killed in Yellowstone. Similarly, a scientist working in a particularly contentious area in Alaska documented that the majority of predation on moose was caused not by wolves, but by bears. In fact, in his study, wolves accounted for only 16% of predation on moose, while black bears and grizzly bears together accounted for about 81%. But even though bears have been recently blamed as culprits in predation on moose in Alaska, including being targeted for lethal and non-lethal methods of control, bears cannot be scapegoats in the same way that wolves can be. The scientists who did the study acknowledged that even suggested that bears be killed like wolves are would be unimaginable. He, quote, "That's a place I don't think anyone wants to go. People have a lot of respect for them," he said. But we claim there's more to the story of who plays the scapegoat role than just mere respect for bears. First, because bears are among North America's most fierce animals, they're especially revered. In Arctic and subarctic regions, the hunting of bears is viewed as paradigmatically male because of the status accorded to them. And in contrast, wolves have long been attributed to the lowest status possible to animals, that are vermin. And killing vermin is considered socially acceptable, even desirable. Second, Alaska inherited a culturally ingrained hatred of wolves handed down first from Europe, then from early American pioneers, and then from Western expansionists. In fact, wolves were the target of the first wildlife laws passed by early American settlers, as a wolf bounty was established as early as 1630. Although it could be argued that bears have posed as many practical problems as wolves have, they are not subject to the kind of negative myths that have been foisted on wolves. Wolves have long been constructed in the popular imagination as symbolizing danger, while bears have escaped such symbolism. Evidence of this can be found in children's stories. Whereas the wolf is an evildoer blowing down houses of little pigs or devouring grandmother and attempting to eat Little Red Riding Hood, bears are benign, even if they're annoyed at Goldilocks trespassing on their private property. In addition, they're considered to be cuddly, as the popular teddy bear aptly illustrates. Now, interestingly, Barclay, who is a historian, claims that in colonial America, wolves were really not as large a problem for colonists as they were for administrators who were responsible for the economic growth for the colonies and for attracting new settlers. Barclay argues that if wolves were indeed a problem, then settlers would not have needed the incentive of bounties to kill them. Instead, settlers would have killed individual problem wolves, such as those caught killing livestock. He concludes that the newly emerged modern state abstracted the problem of a few wolves being problems into a scary stereotype of wolves that threatened the safety of communities, and then offered the bounties for wolf heads as a way to attract new livestock producers and settlers. Barclay documents that the state has a history of strategically constructing myths about wolves, where there seems to be no evidence that the state has conducted similar wolf making about bears. There's also the mythological relationship that bears share with masculinity. For example, the mytho-poetical men's movement celebrates the archetypical wild and hairy man, and this seems very bear-like to us. In contrast, labeling a man a wolf implies that he sexually harasses women, which is increasingly considered to be antisocial behavior. In addition, gay men have created a subculture of bears, or masculinized men who celebrate hairy and large men. Bears then seem to have a special link with masculinity that wolves don't. This article argues that policymakers in Alaska retrofitted an earlier form of masculinity, frontier masculinity, as a way to garner public support for their controversial wolf control projects. While traditional frontier masculinity emphasized sportsmen's rights to kill wolves, the framing of the issue utilizing retro-frontier masculinity employs new strategic emphases, vilifying opponents as feminized, casting wolf hunters as paternalist protectors, reifying the masculine family provider role, and framing the issue as fundamentally about competition. Retro-frontier masculinity is deployed on a statewide basis, reflecting the whole fact that states are gendered. We hope this work opens up another area where sociologists may examine issues of gender. In particular, this work contributes to the analysis of how the state may construct and sustain a symbolic form of masculinity as a way to manage systemic threats to public manliness. Our ideas about retro-frontier masculinity further strengthen sociological understandings about how masculinity is not just a property of individuals, but is also deployed at the state level by policymakers. In addition, our work highlights not only how masculinity is socially constructed, but how the social construction of masculinity is inherently interwoven with the social construction of frontiers, with wilderness, scapegoats, and with wolves and other wildlife. Finally, this work documents how the symbolic politics of masculinity have not only human victims, but non-human ones as well. In Alaska, wolves are paying for the state's deployment of retro frontier masculinity with their lives. Thank you.
I wonder how you would see Sarah Palin fitting into this dynamic, which I'm sure was on other people's minds too. Is she sort of adopting a male kind of gender role, or did she upturn this at all, do you think?
That's a very, very good question. I've given some thought about it. The way that masculinity, the way that gender works is that everyone has to collude in the system. And gender, in the way that we construct it in Western societies, it's a dichotomy. You're either masculine or you're feminine. There's really no room for people in the middle. And I think that Sarah Palin takes this very hyper-feminized stance, and in a way that supports and plays against that retro-frontier masculinity. I'm not sure about the validity of this, but a colleague told me right as I was getting on the plane that Sarah Palin had reacted to the health care bill as saying, don't retreat, reload. And I think that this is, she's playing that very typical role when she does that kind of stuff. In a separate paper I recently presented on what I'm calling the bimboization of Sarah Palin, where the media has bimboized her and separated her out, but as a way to construct her as very feminine, everything not masculine. But Sarah Palin, just like any other popular figure, shows how we collude in the system to support. Yeah.
She seemed to excite a lot of, excite's not the right word. She seemed to attract so much interest, partly because she had that frontier thing going. I mean, you could just read on blogs how many men were thrilled to have this woman with a gun, however self-constructed that myth was, or constructed for her.
Yes.
So it was a really interesting dynamic.
Yes, 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 yes.
She situates herself as the object of that masculine gaze. That's obviously she's almost situating herself. She sort of exploits that position and eroticizes that sort of masculine, retro-masculine perspective that we take.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah.
She got busted, or she's been critiqued for that map, vulnerable democratic districts across America, and she put bullseye marks over them.
Yes, yes. Yeah. Yeah, so she's an example of how state policymakers, even after she's no longer governor, that she's still very influential in the policy arena, and how she's working along with everyone else to reify retro-frontier masculinity. And I think that as our economy continues to degrade, that we're going to see an even more emphasis on controlling wildlife, on control of wolves, on this whole idea of men being paternalist protectors of their communities, putting meat on the family table, that we're going to see these kind of ideas become even stronger.
I was waiting to hear you say anything about the state's effort at vasectomies for wolf control program.
That was part of certainly some of the articles to the letter to the editor and newspaper articles that we read. That was under Knowles, right?
Right, that was under Knowles, and the program actually, the last of the wolves, I think, just died off in the past 10 years or so. And the program apparently was fairly effective for the wolf packs maintaining their established population so that new packs didn't move in. It was actually fairly effective, as I understand, in sort of controlling the wolf numbers. But in the context of your paper, it seems like the ultimate demasculization.
Yeah, absolutely. And letter to the editor especially vilified that as being this sissified approach birth control for wolves and certainly vasectomies for wolves. How silly can you get? And one of the things about wolf policies, and which we all know, is that a lot of the state-instituted wolf policies have no basis in reality. They have no basis in scientific fact. But that doesn't matter, because you can frame the issue. They frame the issue the way that is going to benefit them. And a lot of it is, being re-elected to the legislature. Ralph Seekins, we were able to get him unseated in Fairbanks. And Mike Kelly, who has also been very influential in wolf control rhetoric, won by 4 votes. Just 4 votes. And so it hangs in the balance. It's just this real thread.
Okay, I guess it's on. I got a sore throat, it's a little scratchy or whatever, but I have an interesting relationship with this question. First off, get some sympathy from the audience. I worked in that sequencebreakdown.com there in Fairbanks, and have very strong views on, the idea of dominion over nature and subduing nature, as whether that's healthy or not. And on the other side, I guide hunters and I've trapped wolves, and I've lived here in Alaska all my life and participated on a variety of levels. I grew up eating moose meat, for instance. My dad, it wasn't like a mythological explanation or a need. It was something that he chose to do. We ate fish and moose, and it was good. That big, I'm healthy.
Right.
But what, within your theory of frontier masculinity or retrofitting, is there room for consumptive use, an explanation of consumptive use or hunting outside of the framework of a masculine ideal or, the mythological ideal?
Oh, sure. Yeah, absolutely. The retro-frontier masculinity is not a kind of masculinity that individual men are held accountable to. Our whole idea is that masculinity shapes the state, that the state is a gendered institution. As far as how individual families put meat on their table, absolutely, people have to eat. People have to eat. And in rural Alaska, fresh meat, wild meat, and fish is what's there. So, of course, it's. If you're asking me if I'm anti-hunting and anti-consumptive use, I'm actually not. I love moose meat as much as the next person.
Well, I think that's part of the identity crisis right now, is for someone like myself, I can find myself pretty much in a room where, there's a schism where, if you're in the middle where you can see a place for, I believe that you need to harvest from both sides. If you have a consumptive use on an ungulate population, then it's appropriate to account for those calories in a predator population. And how that's done, there's definitely, concern. I've profited economically off of sport hunting, as part of, something that I do. And I've heard extreme examples of masculinity. I've had clients bear hunting, sitting there on a nice day in the spring, wanting to shoot a bear because they want to, have sex with their mistress on the bear rug. I've been told that on a nice day, and some of these, the real examples are probably, I have even more extreme examples than that, but I think that this issue with this, I would call it the Seekins faction or whatever, this side of it's made a concerted push here lately. It's a big issue among hunters and non-consumptive users. Right
Yeah,
now.
absolutely. But it's no accident that most sport hunters are men. It's no accident that most consumptive users, their meat is used by families. And I think that's something that we always have to keep in mind. And in traditional Alaska Native culture, from what I've read in the anthropological literature, the men would typically make the kill, and then someone would go back to the village and get the women to come butcher and process. And in the old anthropological films of caribou kills, for instance, that's what you'd see. You'd see the men doing the kill and then sitting around smoking while the women were doing the butchering. So it's a family activity, it's a community activity. So,
Division of labor,
people have to eat. Yeah, people have to eat. I mean, you can't grow broccoli and vegetables in rural Alaska in the Northwest. It's not going to happen. Got to eat.
I would say that there's a huge philosophical or religious component on both sides of the issue as well, And I would also say that it's, exploitation or masculinity in regards to nature extends beyond consumptive use. I've seen examples of, wildlife photography or whatever, the same form of exploitation of nature, the same tie-in to, or, mountain climbers, bagging a peak or whatever.
Right.
I mean, I would say that there's, as far as super masculinity, there's impactual, there's in a variety of different senses,
Yeah,
Boy,
absolutely. And gender is one of the more fundamental of our ways of categorizing people. And historically and even prehistorically, that seems to be true. Whether the differences between men and women are biological or whether they're psychological or whether they're socially constructed really doesn't interest me that much. What interests me is how we get this masculinity played out on a huge societal level, like at the level of the state, and the way that we create social institutions like the family and religion, like you were talking about, and ideologies in order to support and reproduce gender relations. It's fascinating. I'm glad you share my interest.
Yeah, very much so, yeah.
That was just an interesting last observation, and I thought, the difference between sort of wolf policy and mountain climbing is that, one is quite a bit more violent in some form. I mean, physically, materially more violent, and so I think that should probably be taken into consideration as well. That we can redirect masculinities towards less materially violent, sort of activities, because your paper is very much about how masculinity scapegoats the wolf, and what we don't want to do is reinscribe the scapegoating of masculinity, right? And the process of doing that, and so that seems sort of a difference. And maybe one way we could do this, you have the race traders, right? White men who refuse to identify as being white. Maybe we could do gender traders.
Yeah.
Where we refuse to identify with the sort of frontier masculinity.
And there is certainly a long tradition dating back to the late 60s and early 70s of men who are gender traders. I think it's really we have to be very careful not to be seen as bashing men, individual men, because as soon as we start critiquing masculinity, lots of times we get accused as being male haters, male bashers. And as soon as we do that, people who need to listen turn off. So we've got to be real careful the way that we talk about that. And that's why I actually don't study where I'm not even interested in the masculinity of individual men. I study masculinities as a social institution. And especially the way that the states, the state level, that masculinity is played out and deployed on the state level. And I think that your idea of how we can challenge that as individuals is a really valuable one.
Film crew actually has to break down because we have another event coming in here soon, and these poor folks have been going since 8:30 this morning. But thank you very much.
Thank you.